This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight is Dimitri Lascaris. He's coming to us tonight from Greece. Dimitri, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Regis. Always a pleasure.
Oh, it's always my pleasure. We've talked about in the past the ICJ ruling against Israel. All that did, well, it emboldened a lot of people, but I read something where it even emboldened Israel and the United States. They basically thumbed their noses at this ruling, and they've obviously done nothing to stop. But now there's talk of a ceasefire. What can you tell us about that?
Well, actually, I was just in terms of the ceasefire, just read a statement by Hamas, a senior Hamas official, about their proposal, and they are remaining, it seems, adamant in their position that any ceasefire must be permanent. The Israelis have been trying to reserve to themselves, they want to get the hostages, but they want to reserve to themselves the right to resume the massacre of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And it's entirely understandable that Hamas or any other organization, it's not just Hamas, and the Palestinian people in general would say, our strongest point of leverage is the hostages that are in our custody. If we give them up without ironclad assurances that you aren't going to resume killing us, then you could easily resume the slaughter. And at that point, we'll have no way effectively to bring it to an end other than by force of arms, which is extraordinarily difficult for us to do because our weapons are so inferior to yours. So we're not prepared to give up those hostages, which is our greatest source of leverage, until you give a binding commitment not to resume the slaughter. So I think that's an issue that is, Hamas seems to be sticking by its guns, and understandably so. Where it seems to be perhaps showing a little bit of wiggle room is the language that I read in the statement by the Hamas official a few hours ago didn't insist upon release upon all the prisoners in Israel's custody. Thousands of them are in Israel's custody. And the Western media doesn't call them hostages, but that's really what they are. There's no lawful justification for the detention of the vast majority of these people. And in fact, it's not clear that there's a lawful justification for the detention of any of them, because generally they are being detained due to determinations by Israel's military courts, which are kangaroo courts, almost 100% conviction rate. They don't have any meaningful due process. So really, there's no basis to attach any credibility whatsoever to their convictions, absent some kind of independent verification of the allegations that are being made against the people who have been convicted. So, we should be referring to those people in Israel's custody as hostages as well. And there's far more of them than are in the custody of, than Israelis are in the custody of Hamas. So in any event, it may be that Hamas is prepared to accept the release of less than all of the hostages in Israel's custody, but clearly, whatever number it is going to be a far larger number than the number of hostages that are in Hamas's custody. My overall sense about this, I should just add, Regis, is that Israel has receded considerably, based on what we know of its current position, from the very, very hard line that it took at the outset. It said, we aren't going to stop hostilities until you release all the hostages. And we're not going to stop hostilities until Hamas has been destroyed, completely destroyed. There's a serious discussion going on now, which would see if they can iron out the differences between them. Israel ceasing attacks on Gaza before all the hostages have been released, and without Hamas being destroyed, without Hamas's senior leadership being expelled from the Gaza Strip, and potentially, they would also be willing, Israel, to enter into this deal with a requirement that they withdraw entirely or almost entirely from Gaza, their military forces. This would be a major, major capitulation on the part of Israel. And I think what we can take away from this, whatever the outcome of these negotiations may be, is that the resistance that Hamas has put up and the other Palestinian militant groups, the ICJ's decision, the casualties that Israel has suffered, the damage that's being done to its economy, all of these things which you and I have been talking about for months now, has really put Israel in a position where it has to make major, major compromises and resile from the extremist hardline position that it took from the outset. And that's going to have long-term implications for Israel. If Israel is perceived by its adversaries in the region to have been defeated, and I think that that's exactly what's emerging here, that this is shaping up to be a major, colossal defeat for Israel, that's going to have long-term implications for Israel that are very negative.
Wow. Well, I think given their track record, they can't be trusted. Just my opinion. I think the Palestinians and Hamas, the PLO, know that better than anybody. But there's another interesting development. I read that Indonesia is preparing to bring a suit to the ICJ declaring that the state of Israel is illegal and has no foundation in law. Can you comment on that briefly?
Well, it's hard to know precisely what Indonesia has in mind, but I can tell you what I think is clear as a matter of international law. And what is clear as a matter of international law is that Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, Israel claims that East Jerusalem is now part of Israel. That's a flagrant violation of international law. International law clearly has conferred upon East Jerusalem the status of occupied Palestinian territory. It was reserved by the United Nations to be the capital of a future Palestinian state. That's clearly illegal. Israel has effectively, not formally, but effectively annexed the whole of the West Bank. I mean, there's no meaningful sense in which the Palestinian people exercise sovereignty over really any part of the West Bank. So although they haven't adopted a law declaring formally that West Bank is part of Israel, in fact, de facto, they're treating it as such. That too is clearly a violation of international law. The West Bank, again, like East Jerusalem, was set aside by the international community, the United Nations, for a future Palestinian state. The Israelis have also illegally annexed the Golan Heights, which clearly is part of the sovereign territory of Israel. And in that case, they actually adopted a law declaring it to be part of Israel. This is a flagrant violation of international law. So as to the extent Israel defines its borders at all, and that's a serious issue because Israel, I think, was quite intentionally avoided doing that in order to give itself sort of the space to constantly expand and acquire by conquest territory adjacent to the internationally recognized boundaries of Israel. To the extent it's defined its boundaries, those boundaries are clearly illegitimate under international law. So it may well be that that's going to be the focus, and that sounds like that's going to be the focus of Indonesia's application before the International Court of Justice. The last thing I'll say about this, Regis, is I think this decision by the ICJ in the genocide application brought for South Africa has just opened up a whole can of worms for the West and for its proxies around the world. What the decision showed of the ICJ, 15-2, including with the concurrence of the Western judges, all the Western judges, the German judge, the French judge, the US judge, who served as a legal advisor under the Obama administration, the Slovakian judge, the Japanese judge, the Australian judge, all countries that have historically been very, very supportive of Israel. These judges joined with the non-Western judges by a margin of 15-2 to say that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, the worst crime that any state or non-state actor can commit, both as a legal and a moral matter. And the only judges who disagreed were the Israeli judge, who was appointed or nominated to the court strictly for purposes of adjudicating this case, as was Israel's right, and the Ugandan judge. And what's interesting about the Ugandan judge's decision is that the moment the decision came out, the government of Uganda disowned the decision of the Ugandan judge and said, this does not represent the position of our government. So it was almost unanimous. And I think the whole non-Western world looked at this and said, wow, it's possible to obtain justice before the International Court of Justice in a claim asserted against a Western nation or a state that is closely allied with the West. So it's not just Indonesia. We may be seeing some very other interesting claims. And what I want to mention in that regard is the government of Nicaragua. There was a report in Al Mayadeen a few days ago, seems intent upon bringing a claim against 4 Western nations, including Canada, for complicity in Israel's genocide, for failure to comply with the obligation of all signatories to the Genocide Convention under Article 1 to prevent and punish genocide. So we may now be seeing actions before the International Court of Justice targeting Israel's allies for complicity in genocide. This is a real problem for the West.
Wow. Well, there's more. I read just the other day, China now is formally demanding that Palestine become a separate state. What do you think the position of the West and the United States is going to be in terms of China now demanding this?
Well, this is going to be another thorny problem for the West. The West has been saying for decades, and they continue to say it to this very day, that they support a 2-state solution. The creation of an independent Palestinian state. The problem for the West is that they've never actually behaved in a way that is consistent with their rhetoric. Despite the fact that Israel has steadfastly refused for decades to give to the Palestinian people a state, despite the fact that it was building settlements in flagrant violation of international law on land reserved for a Palestinian state, despite the fact that it illegally annexed East Jerusalem, which is supposed to be the capital of a future Palestinian state, it just continued to deepen its relations with Israel and support Israel in every conceivable way, militarily, economically, politically, rhetorically, legally, in every conceivable sense. China coming to the table now and issuing this demand, I suspect that China's serious. I think China, understands perfectly well that there will be no peace in the region until the Palestinian people are given a state, and that whatever happens in the current discussions over a ceasefire in Gaza, the violence will inevitably erupt again, and perhaps even be worse than what we've seen now up until this point in time, unless the Palestinian people are given a state. And this is not only, of course, a terrible injustice for the Palestinian people, but as we can see right now, Regis, this is bringing the whole region to the brink of war. There is, in effect, a low-level war happening now, but mercifully, it hasn't involved a direct attack on the territory of Iran and the use by Iran in a retaliatory series of strikes of its full, destructive capacity, its full missile arsenal, which would have devastating consequences for the region, extremely adverse implications for the global economy. It would have a seriously negative impact on China itself, because China is very reliant upon oil from the Middle East to power its, the world's largest economy, which by purchasing power parity measure is what it has now. So China has a strong interest in seeing this violence brought definitively to an end before it spirals out of control. It's not just about the interests of the Palestinian people, although they are the ones most affected by this injustice. So I think China's serious, and China has the diplomatic heft and the economic weight to really apply pressure here on Israel and its Western sponsors to finally, ensure the creation of a Palestinian state. How that's going to happen, though, Regis, I mean, there's some 800,000 settlers in the West Bank, and these people are rabid fanatics. I mean, they're extraordinarily ideologically committed to living on that land that belongs to the Palestinian people, and they're prepared to use extreme violence to stay there. It's very difficult to see how the Israeli government is going to remove those people from that land. And so as much as I support the position of China, as understandable and as reasonable as it is, as consistent as it is with international law, there is a serious question about whether a two-state solution is practically possible at this stage. The only other alternative, if we're going to bring an end to the suffering and the violence, is a one-state solution in which everybody has an equal right. And if that happens, you can kiss goodbye to the so-called Jewish state, because the Palestinian people are going to constitute a majority of that population, and Israel will no longer have, its Jewish population will no longer have the ability to dominate the Palestinian people within the state of Israel by force of numbers.
Wow. There was another headline in an article that I read. Biden is to punish Israeli settlers for violence in the West Bank. I thought that was laughable. I mean, in light of what you've just said, Dimitri, this has got to be a joke.
Yeah, because, Biden's, as we all know, Regis, the United States has wielded sanctions as a brutal weapon to cause untold suffering to civilian populations around the world. It's done that to Cuba. What it's done to Cuba by means of economic sanctions is absolutely inexcusable and inhumane. It attempted to do that to Venezuela and caused immense suffering to the Venezuelan people. It, of course, attempted to do that to the Russian Federation with disastrous consequences for the West. That was an abject failure. It did it to Iraq. And you may recall that Madeleine Albright thought it was entirely justifiable that the sanctions imposed upon Iraq caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. So how do you justify to the world having imposed all of those sanctions and many others with devastating impacts on civilian populations without imposing a single sanction on Israel when the whole world can see that Israel is committing a genocide openly, brazenly, and bragging about it? So what Biden is doing is he's engaging in theater. He wants to be able to say his administration has imposed sanctions on Israel, and in fact, it applies the law equally. The problem, of course, is that this is going to have absolutely no impact whatsoever, these sanctions, on the behavior of Israel. It's not going to impact the Israeli government. The leaders of Israel are not being touched. They're not being subjected to travel bans, sanctions. This isn't going to have a meaningful impact on the Israeli economy. This isn't going to have a meaningful impact on the Israeli military and its ability to brutalize the Palestinian people. These settlers, to the extent they're affected at all, these people are so fanatical, they probably would say, well, fine, I won't travel to the United States. I have to put up with some economic sanctions. This is my God-given right to live on this land, and I'm going to do that no matter what Joe Biden does. But even if it changes their behavior, even if Biden's sanctions on a handful of violent settlers alters their behavior, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to the sea of violence to which Palestinians are subjected on a daily basis, the vast majority of which is coming from the Israeli military. And they're not being touched. In fact, Biden is continuing to funnel to them billions of dollars of deadly weapons, despite the imposition of these so-called sanctions on a handful of settler thugs. This is all theater, Regis, and nobody should take this seriously. And in fact, I hope that important players at the United Nations call out the United States for engaging in this subterfuge, because that's all it is.
Yeah. Talking about Biden, I see a real problem. He's supposed to be the president, but he's seriously compromised intellectually and physically. And when you look at who is making important policy decisions, important decisions in what's happening, militarily and funding around the world, it isn't Biden. It's not even Blinken so much anymore. It's Kirby and Sullivan, and now most recently, Victoria Nuland is back center stage. To me, this indicates complete chaos and a disconnect in the White House. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
This is a frightening situation, Regis. I mean, it's very hard to discern who is in control at the White House. You know, Joe Biden, the man could barely utter a coherent sentence without reading from a script, and even sometimes even the script is inadequate to make him comprehensible. And we're supposed to believe, and just looking at the condition that he's in. When I saw a video of him walking yesterday from a helicopter on the White House lawn to the White House. He looked like he was barely able to put one foot in front of the other. You know, I think it's time for Joe Biden to withdraw from the political scene. I have to say, and this is purely speculation on my part, Regis, but I think it's something. One possible scenario here that may play out is that the Democratic Party elite is ultimately going to produce another nominee for this is I could be completely wrong about this, but it would not at all surprise me to see them produce another nominee far enough in advance of the election to allow that nominee to be viable. Maybe somebody like Gavin Newsom, for example. And they're basically having Biden take a bullet right now for the neocon project, and particularly for the grotesque injustices in the Middle East. So he'll wear that for the rest of his life, which is probably not going to be much longer given his state. And somebody else will be parachuted into the role of Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States, who can plausibly say, well, that had nothing to do with me. I'm not responsible for what the Biden administration did. You know, if it turns out that I'm wrong about this, I'm not predicting this. I just think that that's a possible scenario. But if it turns out that that doesn't happen and Biden ends up being the nominee, I mean, how do people imagine this man functioning for another 4 years? He barely functioned now. You know, and the situation is becoming increasingly dangerous in the world, especially in the Middle East. I mean, we need somebody who has all of their faculties available to them. This is sheer insanity that they would put him forward as the nominee for another 4 years.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think he's going to make it to the finish line. I don't see how any of the people in the Democratic National Committee, Wall Street, whoever the power brokers are, they're looking at this man, and they're not out there publicly, but you got to know they've been talking. He's going to lose it for them. He doesn't stand a chance.
A poll just came out, showed he's 5 points behind Trump. You know,
yeah. And you know, Trump has been hammering him, but Jimmy Dore, somebody sent me this clip from Jimmy Dore. I like what he's doing, but I don't have the time to watch him all the time. But he was doing a stand-up gig somewhere. It wasn't his regular show, but same method. He had his computer there, and he was showing these clips of Biden. He couldn't complete a sentence, couldn't even pronounce a word. He didn't know. I looked at that and I said, oh my God, this is worse than what I thought.
Yeah. We're talking about a banana republic here, you know, Regis. That's what the United States is becoming. I mean, it's amazing. You know, amazing.
All right. So last thing I want your opinion on, because everybody is waiting. Millions of people are waiting. Tucker Carlson is or was in Moscow, and he interviewed Putin. It's confirmed. You know, the Kremlin confirmed. Nobody gave any details about it. My thoughts originally were that, Tucker, I hope you have done your research. I hope you don't come across as some cocky, U.S.-centric, whatever you are, journalist. You've become with tremendous respect. And if you're going to be true to your word, you want the American people to hear Putin and his side, you better give him the opportunity to do that. We'll see what happens. What are your thoughts?
I think it's actually been incredibly entertaining to watch the freak out by the the U.S. political and media elites over the fact that Tucker Carlson was going to interview Putin. I mean, you have Billy Crystal, or not Bill Crystal, not Billy Crystal, Bill Crystal, I believe it is, former New York Times columnist, a frothing at the mouth neocon, saying that they shouldn't allow Tucker Carlson back into the United States or some nonsense like that. I saw another claim by some other frothing about neocon that they should impose sanctions on Tucker Carlson. There have been statements. Somebody with a very large following on Twitter, I think he uses a fake name, said that Tucker Carlson suggested he had become a legitimate military target for the Ukrainian army by virtue of doing this. And I think the tweet got something. I think Glenn Greenwald was talking about this tweet, got something like 2,000 likes. I mean, it's absolute hysteria because the West has lost control of the narrative from the moment that somebody like Tucker Carlson goes and interviews Vladimir Putin. They have steadfastly avoided the mainstream media in the West interviewing Vladimir Putin for the past 2 years, since the SMO that began in February of 2022. Even though, this is an existentially dangerous war with massive security and economic implications for the West. Tucker Carlson put out a video explaining why he was doing this, and I think he said with complete justification, whatever you think of Tucker Carlson, whatever you may feel about his politics on issues that matter to you, the point that he made, I think, was absolutely correct and compelling, and that is, the function of journalism, especially when you're dealing with a war and a dispute of this nature that has such profound consequences for people in the West, is to allow the citizenry to hear from all sides of the dispute and then decide for themselves what is true and what is false. The attitude that the Western media and political elites have taken from day one is to deprive us of access to the Russian perspective. Why would that be in the interests of peoples in the West? I mean, if we are to be trusted to cast a vote and decide who can be the prime minister or the president of our countries, why can we not be trusted to decide for ourselves whether a leader like Vladimir Putin is telling the truth? There was an interview that was done. I just thought this was astonishing. Regis, Sergei Lavrov went to the United Nations recently. I think he was there like a week or two ago, and CBS interviewed the man. Okay, and I think Sergei Lavrov is a very important figure on the world stage. Again, whatever you may think of him, he's widely respected, and he speaks with great authority. He's a member, if I understand correctly, of the Russian Security Council. It's not just, the top diplomat for the Russian Federation, and has been for many years. So they sit down and they interviewed him. I found that surprising because it was an American media organization interviewing him. I looked for the complete interview, and all I could find was a 3-minute segment. So I thought, this is weird. The whole interview lasted 3 minutes? That can't be. So then I went to the Foreign Ministry of Russia's website, and I found a transcript of the entire interview. And the whole thing lasted a hell of a lot more than 3 minutes, but they only showed us 3 minutes of the interview. They took the little pieces of it that they liked, that they thought were most useful to them, and deprived their audience of the rest, the vast majority of the interview. This is absolutely extraordinary. So I think whatever you think of Tucker Carlson, good on him. It's going to be fascinating to see how the public in the West reacts to this interview, because for once they're going to get to hear Vladimir Putin speak since this conflict erupted in February 2022, to speak at length about the position of the Russian Federation without any attempt to sanitize what he's saying. So it's going to be quite a show.
Yeah. Now, I've been trying to remind people that Oliver Stone spent several weeks, over several months, interviewing Vladimir Putin several years ago. He produced 6 separate interviews. I've seen them all. It was incredible. And I can't claim that Oliver is a friend of mine, but we have communicated. He's appearing in my first video, The Ghost of Jeju. And I said to him, Oliver, these interviews were absolutely fantastic. You know what he said to me? Nobody is listening. I was asking him if he would come back again and continue to interview Putin a year ago. He said, nobody's listening. Now, I bring this up because I think this is several years that have gone by since Oliver Stone came here and was castigated roundly everywhere. He couldn't even raise money in the United States to produce his movies. He had to go overseas to get money. But here we are, and several years later, the climate has changed. And where some of those people in the United States are saying he should be arrested, not let back in the country, sanction him, he's a fair game military target for Ukraine. There's millions and millions. I mean, I'm thinking it's over 150 million people that are waiting to see this interview. I think the time is different, and I hope that Tucker will have a huge impact on American thinking. And Dimitri, we have to think Donald Trump is going to piggyback on this. There's no doubt about it. What are your thoughts?
I think this is going to be one of the most widely watched interviews in the history of interviews, frankly. And it's precisely because the West has done so much to suppress the perspective of the Russian Federation at a time when the West is locked in, what the Russian Federation, I think, rightly views as an existential struggle with NATO. That interest in this interview has been piqued, and there's just no way. Apparently, Elon Musk has given assurances to Tucker Carlson that he's not going to do anything to suppress the interview. So much attention has been drawn to it by the hysteria, the outright laughable hysteria of the Western political media elite, that there is going to be a huge and absolutely enormous audience for this thing. And that's why I say it's just going to be absolutely fascinating to watch what's going to happen. And this could really deliver a death blow to the entire rancid narrative about this depraved proxy war, which is already, on its last legs from a propaganda perspective. So, I'm going to be buying a bag of popcorn, sitting back and watching this show. It's going to be something to behold.